when we think of the Tudors, we think of them quite a lot through the vision of what they're wearing. So it's a huge part of how we see the Tudors. It's also a really important part of how the Tudors saw themselves.
Hello and welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. Today I'm going to be speaking to Eleri Lynn about fashion at the Tudor Court. But if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. And if this is your first time, hello, welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. If you love British history, you are definitely in the right place. We have a library of historian interviews, virtual tours, and history documentaries for you to check out on this channel. And you can also join me live each Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time for Tea Time History Chat Live. So, like I say, today I am joined by Eleri Lynn, a fashion and textiles curator, author and historian specialising in the Tudor period. And Eleri gained her experience as an assistant curator within the furniture, textiles and fashion department at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London before becoming curator of the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection at Historic Royal Palaces. She's appeared on many TV documentaries, including BBC Two's Art That Made Us and BBC One's Elizabeth Fashioning a Monarch. Eleri is the author of several monographs: Fashion in Detail, all about underwear, Tudor Textiles, and Tudor Fashion. This book on which today's interview is based. Eleri has curated several major fashion and textiles exhibitions, which you will have probably heard of: Diana, Her Fashion Story at Kensington Palace in 2017, and The Lost Dress of Elizabeth I at Hampton Court Palace in 2019. Most recently, she was head of exhibitions at National Museum Wales and is a trustee of the Royal School of Needlework based at Hampton Court Palace. She's currently working full-time researching and writing a new book on the history of fashion, which I'm very much looking forward to. Now, patrons have been able to submit their own questions for Eleri, which I will put to her after the main interview. And that portion of the interview will be available to all members of my Patreon, and you can become a patron, access those extended interviews, and put your questions to future interviewers. And there's loads of other History Lover benefits in there as well. And you can join that at patreon.com/British History. You can also support me for free by clicking the thumbs up, subscribing to this channel, and hitting the bell. And now let's get on with today's interview. Welcome, Eleri. Thank you for joining me. Obviously, we've seen each other and kind of spoken on the online history festivals that we've done 3 together at them so far. 1 more to come in the autumn as well on Victorians, but we'll let people know more about that nearer the time. And so I have been looking forward for a very long time to be able to speak to you one-on-one and get really sort of a deep dive into Tudor fashion at court. So thank you for joining me.
Oh no, it's my absolute pleasure, and yeah, it's great to have that opportunity because, as you say, I've done the talks and been on that incredible panel with so many other historians. But yeah, it's a subject that's got so much. It bears that deep dive a little bit. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I have started your book. I've got quite well, as you can see, I've tagged lots of things in it already. And you're right. So what seems like maybe, I don't want to call it a superficial type of subject, but compared to, I don't know, the politics and the whatever. But no, I mean, there's lots in here, and we're going to obviously get into some of it
all
now.
There. Well, all of it is expressed through dress, as I'm sure we'll get into.
Through dress. Yeah. I like it. So I've given everyone a bit of an introduction to you and your work, but would you mind, in your own words, telling us a bit about yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, sure. So I am a fashion historian and curator and author. And I've worked variously at the V&A in the Fashion and Textiles and Furniture department, where I started as an assistant curator and got to look through all of the drawers full of all of these treasures for many years, which was a huge privilege, and then became curator at the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection for Historic Royal Palaces, and that's based at Hampton Court. So, equally wonderful. But you know, if kind of expecting to arrive at the dress collection at Hampton Court and find Tudor treasures, that's not what's there. So the Tudor treasures, you know, the Tudor wardrobe does not exist, and so it prompted me to write my 2 books, Tudor Fashion and Tudor Textiles, about that. So to sort of fill the gap of, well, the things aren't there, so how can we build a picture up of what was there instead? And I'm a trustee at the Royal School of Needlework, which is also at Hampton Court Palace. And I'm currently writing a new book on fashion history. So I'm deep in the research at the moment, so slightly obsessed with kind of, you know, with research and looking through the archives and things like that.
Wonderful. I think, well, it's straight away there, something you said about the whole, you know, the Tudor, you turn up to Hampton Court Palace. Nope, sorry, there isn't. We hear about how many dresses Elizabeth left at the
Yeah,
end of, you know, when she died, but there's nothing. So immediately that was probably a surprise to people. It was a
yeah,
surprise to me when I realized just how little from your talks and your book, just how little remains. And yet, what's the first thing someone will talk about in a new, you know, drama about the Tudors? You know, we've got a vision of what they wore and
yeah.
how they wore it and how important it was.
It was hugely important. And you're right, when we think of the Tudors, we think of them quite a lot through the vision of what they're wearing. So the ruffs and the farthingales and the pearls and those sleeves and the codpieces, all of that. If you take all of that away, you know, you get a very different picture. In fact, so many of those portraits, you know, it's just their faces and hands that isn't swathed in loads of textiles and incredible dress and jewelry. So it's a huge part of how we see the Tudors. It's also a really important part of how the Tudors saw themselves. So they very different from now. You know, when we have fast fashion, disposable fashion, back then fashion and textiles and clothing was a really important way to demonstrate their status, demonstrate their wealth, you know, even their virtue. You know, that they really thought that how you were dressed was a reflection of the inner person. So if you want to really understand the Tudors, you've got to understand what they're wearing.
I love it. So we know, I suppose immediately you think of, well, Elizabeth and her dresses, like I've already said, Henry and his sort of adoption of you know, clothes that showed him as broad, even when he got fat, you know, broad
Yeah,
up top, but you know, lovely calves and etc etc. Codpiece, which
yep,
I have to say, it always surprises me that actually that's still, I think once you get into Tudor history, the codpiece, like, yeah, of course they wore codpieces. When I've taken tours, some people don't know about the codpiece, and there is a Henry VIII at Hever Castle with the, you know, dressed up with his codpiece, and they ask, well, what's that?
what is that? Yeah,
Oh, it's a codpiece. Well, what's a codpiece? And you, oh God, you know, it is actually a very bizarre
it
thing.
is.
Heading
Yeah,
in a head, and they head in a what direct in a disturbing direction, the
yeah.
codpiece as well, doesn't it? I mean, it's
No, it does. I mean, trying to explain that from scratch is a really peculiar thing. Um, and it did, you know, and also the Tudors were hyper aware of the meaning behind it as well. It wasn't just something that they wore and kind of forgot about. They were hyper aware of the symbolism of it, and you know, at pageants and masks and things like that, there are records of some of the gentlemen wearing even more exaggerated codpieces, um, and giving them strange and lewd and rude nicknames. So, you know, desire being one of the tamer ones. But um, it was pure. I mean, it was purely. There's no function to it. It's purely decorative. It's purely there to show off. And yeah, I mean, you know, the history of it is that um, it, that men would wear breeches. and they would tie at the front, but they'd have this little flap at the front so that they could go to the loo, sort of little, they could just untie it and then they could go to the loo. And then this flap became sort of a bit padded, and then, in the early Tudor period, and particularly during the reign of Henry VIII, it became this, appendage, and it's right there in all of the portraits. It's decorated, it's embroidered, it's jeweled sometimes, and I think it is quite a cycle. It's fashionable because you see it across Europe, but I think for Henry there is also a psychological element there of, he's not able to produce a son. He does feel that very keenly, as we know, and so this kind of outward mark of symbol of virility, this appendage right there, all decked out and jeweled. I think it's deeply psychological for him.
Fascinating. So let's go right back then, because I said,
we've gone straight into the
that's fine, because
copies.
we vision Elizabeth, we vision Henry at the 8th. What about his father, Henry VII?
Yeah.
Is he the dowdy miser, king who doesn't want to spend any money on anything, living in, I don't know, brown all the time? What's he like with his fashion?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes and no.
Right.
So we have this image of Henry VII as the dowdy miser, and we can, we see him, looking quite gaunt, in portraits and in dramatizations of him in these kind of long robes. And he was a miser in a lot, and very frugal in a lot of situations. We know that he didn't, for example, give Elizabeth of York, his wife, quite as much money as she would have liked to maintain a wardrobe, and that she undertook quite a lot of repairs of her own clothes. So there were ways in which he was very frugal, but he was really keenly aware of the power of dress to project status. And given the way that he'd come to the throne, which was on the battlefield, but that his heritage was not, it was not as royal as as royal as it could have been. Let's say that he was a kind of minor claimant, and there was a legitimacy, as I'm sure the audience knows. So he didn't have that incredibly solid claim to the throne, but what he did have was that battlefield win and the ability to project that newfound power. Now, at the time, they really believed that clothes made the man. So it wasn't just a decorative, frivolous thing. Outward magnificence really did symbolize your inner virtue, your inner worthiness. So if you were dressed in fine fashion, that's because you were a fine person. If you were dressed as a king, that's because you were a king. And so Henry was acutely aware of that. And so in those pivotal moments when he needed to display that power, such as after the Battle of Bosworth, for his wedding, coronation, for the wedding of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, he spared no expense. So these are times where he decks out himself, his whole family, his court in absolutely the finest fabric available at the time. So silks and cloths of silver, cloths of gold, and interestingly, one of the things that you can do is through his reign, is at those moments where he feels under threat or slightly paranoid, say, for example, when Perkin Warbeck arrives on the scene and says, hey, I'm the real heir to the throne. You can watch the spikes in expenditure in Henry's wardrobe receipts. So he's decking himself out to show his magnificence, but also to kind of bolster himself when he feels a bit under threat. So yes and no, he spent judiciously.
That's interesting. A bit like we might, invest in a new lipstick when we're feeling a bit down.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, you can see the same spike in Catherine of Aragon's expenditure as well. So when Henry comes along, Henry VIII, obviously, and says, Catherine, I'm doubting the legitimacy of our marriage, and also, there's Anne Boleyn waiting in the wings. Catherine starts spending more, a significant amount more. So you're watching the spikes in her expenditure. She's decking herself out perhaps to kind of bolster her queenly status, but perhaps also to make herself feel better, or more attractive. So, it's the equivalent of the lipstick potentially. Yeah.
Interesting. So now, how did Henry, because I noticed in your book you mentioned that Henry VII employs the same tailor who had been the tailor to Richard III, and prior to that his brother Edward IV. Why would Henry do that? What's he trying to do here? Is it just because he's the only tailor in town, or is there anything more to it than that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So yeah, he retains George Lovekin, who was the tailor to the Plantagenet kings. And yeah, he retains him. Now, there are a few reasons for that, and it all ties in with what I was just saying about needing to manifest your right to rule through the way you appear.
Mm-hmm.
And so Henry is not, he hasn't been brought up at the English court in, with those English royal traditions around him. He's been in exile for quite a considerable part of his life. His habits and his manners are quite French and Breton, and they're quite Gallic in that sense. So he needs George Lovekin to dress him, essentially, to show him how the English nobility expect a king to look, so that he can embody that role for him. I mean, it's a little bit, to kind of, modern day parallels, I guess, are in the 20th century, how the royal family was dressed by very specific dressmakers like Hardy Amis and Norman Hartnell, and David Sassoon, couturiers who knew how to dress somebody for the role, especially if they were new to it.
Almost like a costume, isn't it? They knew how to
Yeah,
costume them.
yeah, exactly. And they knew they knew the fabrics and the colors, and how to get hold of them, and how they knew how to dress you for the role you're about to take, exactly like a costume.
So um we also see when in Henry VIII's time, especially, I think, when he's like pitting himself up against Francis I and everything, the clothing is sort of part of that outdoing each other.
Yeah.
Who's the, but you also write that about in the book about how dress is used sometimes to demonstrate friendship, not just sort of that kind of rivalry. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So yes, absolutely. One of the things that the Tudors want to do, in the sense of that rivalry and competition, and particularly Henry VIII, he really wants to place himself as, one of the, he wants that competition with the other European princes. So he spares no expense on his clothes pretty much all the time, and because he wants to have that competition with Francis I. And when they go to the Field of Cloth of Gold, I mean, the preparations for what they're going to wear, is almost one of the biggest parts of the logistics. There is like, well, I'm going to wear this, or what are you going to wear? And it's this back and forth, like, they're preparing for this really, really big Saturday night out, and they want to make sure that they're not outdoing each other. And that's all part of it. It's the diplomacy and the politics. And in a way, that's a kind of sign of friendship and respect, because, that for this occasion, for the Field of Cloth of Gold, they don't want to outdo each other. So they really want to meet on equal terms. On that field. And so that's a whole part of that diplomacy, as well. I'm going to wear this, I'll wear this, and then we'll be equal. But on a much more day-to-day level, clothing is really personal. Clothing is, it's part, you wear it on your body. And so often the Tudors, as an act of friendship or favor, will give gifts of clothing. So that's one of the ways in which friendship is shown. They will allow, it's up to, there's sumptuary laws, which I'm sure we can dive into in a bit, but they allow friends or favorites to wear things that perhaps, that are above their rank. That's a sign of their favour. You can wear sable, even though you're not of a rank to wear sable. I'll allow you to. So that's another sign of favour. But another sign as well is, you know, on a more kind of matey level, I guess, is that, you know, sometimes Henry VIII would, you know, he'd set up these elaborate kind of party, like, you know, parties, you know, masks and pageants and things like, and jousts, and he would sometimes allow his best mate Charles Brandon to dress like him. So, you know, kind of like matchy fashions, you know, and in that's, you know, that's a real sign of favour, because generally the king is supposed to really stand out. But Henry VIII had this kind of this culture at his court, particularly when he was a young man, of, you know, he'd let his best mates, you know, he'd have matchy outfits with his best mates, or sometimes he'd dress down and appear in gentleman's, you know, clothing of a courtier rather than a king, and kind of, you know, burst into a room, and it was a, you know, it was a big joke, because, you know, his courtiers were supposed to go, "Oh, your majesty, we know you anywhere, you can't hide your glory, you know, your inner majesty from just shining through." So he, you know, there were lots of different ways that clothing was used to show favor and friendship, and also that competition as well.
So people probably, I imagine, then wanted to be able to dress a certain way to show status, show favor and all that. But from the other side of it, what were the expectations on people and how they would dress? Sort of all
Yeah.
throughout the court, I'm thinking.
So I think this is a really good place to introduce the concept of the sumptuary law. So sumptuary law goes way back into medieval history. It's the acts of apparel. That means that it's legislated and written in law that if you're of a certain status, if you have certain property or money, you're allowed to wear different things. So if you're a, you know, if you're a member of the immediate royal family, if you're a king and the immediate royal family, you're allowed to wear purple silk and cloth of gold and cloth of silver and certain kinds of fur. So you're allowed to wear ermine. And so, you know, you see these, you know, for example, King Charles III was, you know, crowned wearing ermine and purple. And that goes back to the fact that, you know, centuries ago, that's all, only immediate members of the royal family could wear that. Earls and dukes, they're allowed to wear certain colours, certain silks, certain furs. The lower down the ranks you go, they're not allowed to wear those things. And in fact, you're not allowed to have a doublet of silk if you're not of a certain rank, if you're not a knight or a knight's son. You are only allowed to wear a certain amount of fine wool if you earn over a certain amount per year. So that means you're a skilled craftsman. That assumes you're a professional. And part of this is a protectionist thing. It's to encourage domestic spending on wool for the masses, because that's a hugely important product, and part of the country's GDP. So it's to encourage everybody, you know, everybody who you know needs to be buying wool at home, and also to encourage that spending at home. But a really significant part of it is to make sure that your status is codified, so you can tell just by looking at somebody what rank they are. And yeah, that's hugely important to them. So if you step outside of those boundaries, that's punishable. You know, if you're of the lowest status, you might be put in the stocks. If you're higher status and you step outside that, that can be a bit more serious, because you might be seen as a bit of a threat to the crown if you're dressing in too princely a manner. And so you might get heavily fined, or you might find yourself, if you're crossing the king or the queen too often, you might find that that's a charge leveled against you in a trial of treason, which happened with some of the aristocrats, and yeah, so I'm thinking particularly the Duke of Norfolk had that as a charge against him. He's dressing in too competitive a manner. So yeah, it's hugely important. And I've drifted off now into sumptuary law. I can't remember what the original question was.
Well, I was wondering what the expectations
Oh,
on
the expectations.
people were. Yeah. So we know what they're not allowed to do, but sort of what are
Yeah.
they expected to do?
So they are expected to dress in a way that is reflecting a certain glory on the king and queen. So the courtiers, they're not allowed to dress too much like the king, but they are expected to dress in a way that is grand and lavish and dignified and quite, there's in some of the ordinances you see, the expectations that on certain occasions they will be dressed in similar colours to project a sort of unified court behind the monarch. Because actually, for those foreign ambassadors, what the king wants to show is that he's got a wealthy, unified nobility behind him. So do not even think of invading us, because look, we've got this really
We're
amazing
tight.
gang. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're basically. And so there's that. So it's a fine line to tread between like looking good enough but not too good. And of course, then the rest of the court, those lower down are expected to be in livery. So that's often provided by the king. So you'll see the red wool livery of the yeoman guard. You'll see the green wool of the hunting the hunting team, and as well if you're an official on the sidelines, or actually even an official, a really important official. So, Thomas Cromwell, he's going to be dressed in his finest. But what that probably means for him is, black velvets and things that show his status as as a professional working. He's not a courtier. He's an official. He's got this job to do, and that's reflected in the black velvet that he's wearing.
So, um, who's expected to pay for this? Like the servants in their livery and the like, who picks up the tab?
So if it's so the courtiers will pick up the tab for their clothes, and that's really that's a lot of money. And we know that some of members of the nobility really struggled to afford a wardrobe fit for court. We know that Arthur Throckmorton actually had to, he almost bankrupted himself. He had to mortgage his lands to afford clothes. So the expenditure, expense of that is really hefty. Which is why actually it's even more important to be at court, so you can get favour and land and jobs and titles that bring in all of that money. But if you've got a livery, or say the king or queen want you to be dressed in a certain way, they will provide that. So that you will get a uniform, and it will get recycled and reused for, if you're a guard, that uniform will get recycled and reused. But we also know that, for state events, funerals, weddings, things like that, that courtiers, maids of honor, those staff, those servants and nobility who are around the king and queen, they get fabric provided for them. A number of yards of black fabric or black silk for, or red or white for different events.
We'll come on to colours in a bit, because I'm interested in the symbology of the colours. It's interesting there that, I mean, if they want to just ruin somebody, just stick in a new rule, and
Yeah.
if they're already struggling to pay for it, then
and it's all at the whim of the king and queen. So if if you're on the right side of the king, you can get away with quite a lot. But if you're not, then your clothes can be used against you, or you dressed in the wrong way. So therefore, I'm gonna charge you, fine you.
wow,
So
yeah,
it's a whim.
important. So important. These clothes will be going. So yeah, so we know, we talked about how clothes demonstrate rank, importance, but you alluded to it there a little bit, the importance of you've also mentioned already fabrics, but the colors of the fabric, the decoration. Can we begin with fabrics, because we refer to them quite often, especially the ones I'm about to mention. I just want to know exactly what they actually are. So
Yeah.
like in particular, but feel free to bring up any others you think might be of interest, but cloth of gold, cloth of silver, and the other one is cloth of tissue.
Yes.
Interested in what actually are they?
Right. So they are what they sound like, which is kind of bonkers. So a cloth of gold is a silk woven with real gold. So so to make a cloth of gold, you will take gold bullion and you will beat it into a fine foil, or a very fine film, and then cut it into strips. So already the amount of labor that's gone into just that bit is enormous, and the amount of expense, because you're dealing with gold. And then you take those fine strips and you can either use them as just strips of bullion and weave it in with silk. And so you could weave it in with silk, any color silk. So that's where you get red cloth of gold, because that's gold woven with red silk, or yellow cloth of gold that's woven with yellow silk.
Right.
So that's where those terms come. So that's one thing you could do. Or you can, alternatively, you can wind that film around a core of silk. And that can be used as well. And so cloth of silver is the same, just with silver bullion. So one yard of cloth of silk, cloth of gold, cloth of silver is more than a skilled craftsman in Tudor England would be able to to earn in 10 years.
Mhm.
And so the amount of cloth of silver that is, cloth of gold that's constantly being worn by the royal family just makes them appear otherworldly. They just must have seemed, yeah, completely ethereal. And cloth of tissue, this is one of those things that if you've studied Tudor portraits, you'll know what this is. So if you imagine that incredible portrait of Princess Elizabeth as a young princess by William Scrots, she's in the cloth of um, red cloth of gold dress, but her petticoat is a cloth of tissue. So this is the fabric that is sort of geometric velvet pattern with the raised loops. So I've got it here. I'm just right. I'm not sure it'll right. Let's see. It's this one. This is a back
Yeah.
of my book, and on the sleeves and the petticoats, it's probably not picking up in
Yeah.
detail, but it's this petticoat bit here. So it's raised loops of gold or silver on a velvet ground or a silk ground, and so that's what it is. And again, the the labor and skill that has gone into creating that fabric is immense.
That sounds even more involved than a cloth of gold or cloth of
Yeah,
silver.
yeah, it is. It's sort of conspicuous consumption, really, because you've got these gold loops all over it. There's just, it's the intrinsic value of the fabric alone is one thing. To set up a loom to make a cloth of tissue like that, setting up the loom takes several weeks or months, let alone actually weaving it, because it's such a complicated loom process. And then often always these incredible fabrics are coming from abroad. They're coming from Italy, from Spain, sometimes further afield, from the Ottoman Empire, maybe even China. So they're traveling a long way. And so they're incredibly expensive. They're incredibly valuable. And and also they're demonstrating status and wealth. Yeah, I mean, just it's kind of mind-boggling, the amount of work that
Isn't
went
it
into
layer on
making
layer on
them.
layer? It's
It's layer on layer on layer, and when it's also, I think, one of the things that's really struck me is how the Tudors would have seen these fabrics in the space. If you imagine you're standing in the Great Hall of Hampton Court, and it's night and it's candlelit and torchlit. If you're wearing black velvet or red wool, which most of the court is, the servants and officials, those are fabrics that are very fine and very expensive, but they're very light absorbing. The nobility are wearing silks and, you know, and embroidery, and so they're looking radiant. But, you know, if in walks somebody wearing a cloth of silver, white cloth of silver, say, and, you know, that torchlight's going to hit it, they're going to look different in the space to everybody else. They're going to radiate, I think, this, you know, this light. And so, you know, it's one of the things, you know, about there's lovely descriptions of tapestries as well that have got gold and silver in them, and how people would walk past them, they just shine and catch little glimmers of light just popping here and there. So they have seen it in a very different way than we see them.
Sounds like they would have dazzled. Again, back
Yeah.
to sort of costume. It's like
Yeah.
the main, you know, the role, the lead role
Yeah,
has the
exactly.
best, the brightest costume. So your eyes drawn to them.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think I've referred to them a bit crassly before as Tudor high vis. And, you know, I think that's essentially what it was about.
Sparkly high vis.
Yeah, but yeah,
Very nice.
bling.
Very bling. But yeah, that is it. Just you saying there about the cloth, and then on top of it, it's traveled. So you've got it's exotic. Everyone knows it's had to come from abroad. Everyone
Yeah,
knows how much actual precious metal is in there, how long it would have taken to make.
yeah.
I'm curious about the fabric. Would they make their clothing based on the fabric they can get, or would they commission? So, for instance, in that portrait that you've just shown of Elizabeth, that there's obviously a pattern
Mm.
in that cloth of tissue. Would that have been commissioned, or is that made because that's what they've sort of been able to buy?
That's what they've been able to buy. But that's the power of the merchants. So the
So this is why the merchant
merchants,
class gets so
yeah,
rich.
yeah, they're
Right.
really powerful because um, so, you know, the Italian merchants in London, they were bringing that incredible fabric from Italy, which was being woven in Italy or being traded through Italy from further east. But they're bringing it and then bringing it through via Antwerp, which was, you know, consequently became this incredibly important centre of commerce and trade. And they've got this base in London. Now, the merchants have direct access to the royal court. So we know that they were bringing their wares to directly show to the king, and, you know, later to the queen. So they have audiences where they're bringing their fine wares, and the king and queen have first dibs on the fabrics. They're paying high prices for them. The merchants become incredibly wealthy. And, you know, they're a really powerful class in London and at the royal court. In fact, they're so powerful that they actually end up subsidizing Henry. So when Henry wants to go to war in France in the 1540s, it's actually the merchants of Antwerp and London that give him the loan of money that he needs to do that, because they can afford to do that. And also why their houses are kind of little mini mini fortresses, because they have, you know, these warehouses full of incredibly valuable commodities inside them. So they're showing their wares to the king and queen, who are then choosing the best, and then that's made up into outfits for them. There's a couple of notable exceptions, one of those being the Stonyhurst vestments. So these are the vestments that were commissioned by Henry VII, and he commissioned this range of ecclesiastical vestments that he got all made, woven to order in Florence, so woven to shape these incredible church chasubles and copes with the Beaufort portcullis and the Tudor rose on them. But those were outrageously expensive. They were millions and millions of pounds worth in today's money. And they were so impressive that Henry VIII then used them at the Field of Cloth of Gold. Only a couple of pieces survive, and that's because they were all destroyed. But the Jesuits smuggled some of them out of the country in the early 17th century, and they've survived and now in the hands of Stonyhurst College. And if worth a Google to have a look at those images. Yeah, so but usually they're working with what they've got, but what they've got is really impressive.
Yeah, it's amazing. Those merchants must have added a markup for danger money. I imagine transporting those fabrics all that way, they would have come across a few issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and yeah, they definitely would have. I mean, what's really you're saying that, and it's making me think of the silver. That for the cloth of silver in the later Elizabethan period, they're getting that probably through piracy, or privateering, or I should say, because the main source of silver in the late 16th century is the New World, the so-called New World, which Spain is in control of, and they're bringing silver back across the Atlantic, and it's and fantastic new dyes for different colors. So actually, we know that a lot of the privateers, Raleigh and Drake, they were stealing, looting the silver straight off the Spanish galleons. So that's how we could have got a lot of the cloth of silver.
Yes, interesting.
See, it's all woven in, no pun intended, but it's all woven in with all of the politics of the time, because textiles was such a huge part of the trade for all of the Western European countries, well, and the Ottoman Empire. It was a huge part of it was a huge source of wealth, and so who gets control of the alum mines or the dyes or the silver for the fabric, kind of it's making the most money.
Well, of course, you mentioned wool earlier, and making sure domestic people were buying wool, but of course that's exactly what the wealth of England and Wales really was built on, and our House of Lords says a wool sack in the chamber for that exact reason.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something staggering, like 3/4 of England's GDP in the later Middle Ages. So the entire country was hugely dependent on the textiles trade, on the wool trade, and being able to sell wool and woolen cloth into Antwerp. And actually, that's one of the reasons in the sort of early Elizabethan period, when Antwerp was controlled by, it's in the Netherlands, but was controlled by Catholic Spain. So you have a Protestant country, and they were being persecuted by Catholic Spain, by Philip II's Catholic Spain, and so trading became very difficult. And that's one of the major reasons that William Cecil and the wider court started to look elsewhere. Why they started to look elsewhere, to the New World, into voyages of discovery, to trading with the Ottomans, trading with Russia, to trading with lots of different, and setting out on those voyages, so-called voyages of discovery. There's big explorations across the Atlantic to try and find new sources of trade for the textiles, new materials, new dyes that would help keep them ahead of the game in the textiles trade. So, really a huge catalyst to global expansion was textiles.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, oh gosh, we could go into that, but let's stick to, there's so much.
I know.
Honestly, this is incredible that such a seemingly, like I said at the beginning, sort of almost niche topic is actually, no, it's in front and center of so much, well, all the bigger issues. And
yeah,
so,
absolutely. Yeah, it
so,
is. And I think that's because I think that's the interesting thing when we're looking at history through contemporary eyes. Fashion today is seen as, frivolous. Perhaps it's something that, it's often can be seen as something, for, it's a side issue, that is not central to politics. And yet, it was very, very central to everything, to trade, to commerce, to how they saw themselves, how they saw the world. So yeah, it's, you know, it's huge. It's hugely important.
So let's talk about colours, because you do, again, you mentioned in your book the meaning around different colours. Um, obviously you mentioned purple already. That's just like, yeah, maybe explain a bit about why that would have been the colour for royalty and the immediate royal family. But what else? What other messages did the colour of the fabric convey?
So the Tudors are seeing, they see symbols in everything. Everything is meaningful. They really, you know, they love symbolism, and they're highly literate in it. So, you know, flowers all have a different meaning. Lilies are pure, and um, you know, yeah. So you know, all these flowers have different connotations. All the colors have different connotations, and there's a few reasons for that. That's just because, you know, that's in a way can be folklore, um, or classical or biblical allusions. Um, but also it can be about the expense of the dye. We come back again to that commodity. So purple is incredibly difficult to get hold of and to make into a colour fast dye that will hold. So it's coming from very far away, only very specific mines. You know, certain places in the Far East can create certain dyes. Lapis lazuli, for example, creates a blue. So you have to kind of, you know, that's a mineral that you have to mine. So it's about where the, you know, the wealth, sorry, the sort of specificity of that commodity and how difficult it is to get hold of. But because of that, also it has very specific historical connotations. So purple was the color of the Roman emperor. And so you know, from Rome to Byzantium and Constantinople, purple has that significance.
Right.
And so that's how it gets handed down. It becomes this incredibly high status color that is reserved and meaningful in that way. And, you know, the different colors have different connotations. Very famously, when Catherine of Aragon died, we know that Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII dressed in yellow. And that is shocking because that was the color of hope and renewal, and you know, it's a joyous color, and they are in this color. And we know that all the, you know, the other colors had symbols as well. So and we see them in similar ways. So red, you know, was a very bold color. You know, it's blood and it's virile, and it's, you know, it has that kind of property. But green was very calming. It's the color of nature. It's the color of, you know, of peace and tranquility. So um, when the Queen was about to give birth to Jane Seymour, or, you know, one of Henry's queens, if they were going into confinement, if they were going into labour, they were placed in rooms that were surrounded in green tapestries, verdant tapestries, and lots of kind of that colour that would help calm them and keep them steady and things like that. So, you know, all of these colours, they did have connotations, they had meanings, you know, both coming out of mythology and history, but also to do with how expensive it was to get it and how good it was.
And symbols. So you talked earlier about the copes that Henry VII commissioned with the Beaufort portcullis, and Tudor roses. We know he stuck in anywhere and everywhere he could. Were they the first to use symbols on clothing like that, or and I'm thinking it must have developed as well, because Elizabeth, there seems to be some sort of, you know, emblems and symbology in all of her dress as she goes forward. Do you mind just talking a bit about how they used
Yeah,
symbols on their
sure.
clothing
So
specifically?
they weren't the first to do it.
Right.
I think if you look into, you know, go back into the Middle Ages, you know, the um, symbolism is of clothing is rife. The nobility are all, and the church and the monarchy are all doing it, but they're doing it, I suppose, in quite martial armorial ways, in that they're using coats of arms and ciphers. So it's all very overt. They're using, their family coats of arms, or family crests and things like that. So it's all quite overt. And if you look at the tapestries of the early Tudor period, it's, big coats of arms, or big battle scenes. It's quite, it's big, and it's bold, and it's martial. But something happens in Elizabeth's reign that really kind of ramps that up and makes it a different thing. So in the 1580s, in 1586, George Whitney writes this book of emblems, or publishes this book of emblems for the English court. And what that is hundreds of emblems with little poems underneath them. And it's emblems of, so say a picture of an arrow or a rainbow, or, a different symbol, and the meaning written in a little poem underneath. And the connotations of, so the arrow and the crossbow, that's about martial loyalty. So often then the court might give little gifts of little crossbow brooches, and with the little motto of, my arrow flies only for you, because it's about loyalty, or a rainbow, which signifies the celestial, a spire, pointing to heaven. So it becomes this incredibly complicated language. George Whitney wasn't the first to do it. There was a kind of European trend since the publication, since because the printing press was still relatively new, and so the advent of domestic books and non-secular books, non-religious books, that was quite new and quite a novelty, and it was nice, and to have one of those. So it becomes this incredibly ornate language. But you see those emblems, you see Whitney's emblems appearing everywhere in dress. So you see them being embroidered onto skirts, onto bodices. You see them in jewelry. You see them in portraits. And the Tudor court was the Elizabethan court particularly, was incredibly good at reading those symbols and seeing what they meant, those connotations. And in fact, one of the things I really like is that the little crossbow brooch was given to Elizabeth by Henry Norris's sons. So Norris, who was executed because of charged with adultery with adultery with Anne Boleyn. So he was executed as part of that cohort, but there actually remained quite a close affection between his sons and with Elizabeth I, and that's demonstrated in these gifts of loyalty and signs of affection back and forth between the two. So she was wearing these brooches from the Norris sons.
And was this book, did he sort of collate symbols with their meaning already that would have been known and attached, and he's sort of making this almost dictionary of them, or did he make any up? Do we know?
That's a really good question. I don't know. It might be a bit of both, but I'm guessing there. But I know that he was influenced by a lot of emblem books that were already being printed on the continent. But he wrote these little verses underneath, these little verses that sort of explored the different merits of the symbols. So in doing so, he probably added to the language and the meaning behind them. So if you're adding the word celestial into this poem, then you have you have a new definition for the rainbow and things like that. And you see it really clearly in the rainbow portrait, actually, that hangs in Hatfield House, which is probably the most eloquent example of the language of symbolism in the later Elizabethan period. And she's got a little glove brooch on her bodice, or her ruff, I can't remember now. But she's got a little brooch, which is sort of probably, is almost certainly a gift denoting loyalty and friendship. On her sleeve, she's got a serpent, jeweled applique serpent, which stands for intelligentsia or wisdom, and hanging from its mouth is a little heart jewel, which stands for mercy. So these are virtues that a prince is supposed to have: wisdom and mercy. Obviously, she's got this incredible orange robe, which has got eyes and ears all over it. It's really a really overt way of saying she's seeing and hearing all, I think. On her bodice, she's got these floral motifs, but they're straight out of botanicals and herbals. And so they're more than just floral decoration. They're a way of saying, I'm very learned and scholarly because I've got these incredible books out there classifying the world and this demonstrating mastery of nature. And of course, she's holding a rainbow. And so that shows that with a little motto that says non sine sola iris, which is no rainbow without the sun. But the rest, there's no sun. She's the sun. There's no rainbow without her. And so in it, she's the goddess of flowers. She's the goddess of the sun. She's everything. That in this portrait, it's incredible. And the Tudors would have read it. They'd have understood that.
And does that book still exist in an actual fully formed format? Or
yeah, there's a few of them. So yes, I think the British Museum has got one, and there's a couple of facsimiles as well. So I've only managed to get my hands on the reproductions. But
sounds like a fascinating book. It's almost like I love anything about symbology and coats of arms and all of that. And I'll pick up a book about tattoos because it will have, it will just be a book of symbols and their meanings.
It's called A Choice of Emblems by George Whitney, and it was published in 1586. So if you Google it, there are prints in different museum collections as well. So in museum collections on online searches, you can see examples of these pages. So it's well worth having a look at because they're really lovely.
So before, I want to ask you about jewelry and precious stones and how that was used. But just before we move on, because you mentioned the rainbow portrait there. Now, I know you curated the exhibition at Hampton Court Palace about the Baxton altar cloth and whether that was do you think in that portrait that all of those fabrics were actually something she would have worn? I'm thinking the eyes and ears especially, or is that something added to the portrait for the purpose of the portrait?
So that's a brilliant, that's an open-ended discussion that fashion historians have. So is it artistic license? Is it the portrait? Is that the artist projecting that magnificence, or is it real? I think it's depicting a real outfit. There's a fantastic book written by Janet Arnold, who is, a really seminal, important fashion historian. The book is Elizabeth's Wardrobe Unlocked, and in it she discusses this, and she talks about the fact that there are precedents of clothes that were listed in the inventories as stained, and what that means is painted. So they were painted with things on, and so her hypothesis, and I think I agree with it, is that the robe that's shown with the eyes and ears is stained. Those are really painted on the silk. And the reason I think it's real is that clothing was so important, and so they they would have wanted to display their finery in detail. And we know in the inventories that survive that the detail on these things is intricate. The descriptions of them, they are embroidered, they are stained, they have got this incredible detail. So from the inventories, we know those things existed, and I think that she'd have wanted to have appeared that way. She did. They're wanting to show their best clothes.
The eyes and ear thing, it just always really fascinates me. And when you think about the point in her reign that was painted as well, and she's got more and more plots. She's more and more paranoid about this, not naming a successor because she doesn't want them to, you know, sort of act on it before she's
Yeah.
gone. And you think, yeah, eyes and ears. So she's wearing that around the court. I've got my eyes and my ears open, people. You
Yeah,
can't pull
yeah,
one over on me.
exactly. I think what's really interesting is that it's hanging in Hatfield House and that it's very likely commissioned by the Cecils.
Mm,
And so there's a certain, if we're reading it that they've commissioned this, there's a that there's an element there um, that's really interesting, that's bringing their role in her reign into focus. Are they her eyes and ears?
mm,
They, as her, in her reign, they've got that role. Is that gift, is that brooch of the a gauntlet, are they her right hand? Is that what they're saying? So there's so much there that you can read into what they might want to be saying about their importance to her.
mm,
And similarly, we know that people who've, other people who commissioned portraits of her. So, there's a portrait of her in Hardwick Hall, commissioned by Bess of Hardwick, and she's got this. In it, Elizabeth is wearing this skirt full of symbols. There's fishes, there's spires, there's clouds, there's rainbows. Very likely that was painted or stained as well, and if not, very possibly embroidered by Bess of Hardwick. But is this a gift that Bess gave Elizabeth, that Elizabeth then wore for this portrait as a sign of favour back to Bess? There's this whole language of how people are using the clothes. Is
mm.
it's a thank you letter, or what's going on there? Yeah.
So I said I'd like to ask you about jewelry, so I will now. So how was, we talked about the fabrics, and how was jewelry used and worn? I'm always fascinated when I notice that, like, for instance, pearls aren't hanging for ears; they're hanging from hair and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And obviously, the fabrics are incredibly precious, but actual diamonds, pearls, rubies, etc. How were they used? And presumably they were repurposed, but how would that happen as well?
Yeah. So jewelry is incredibly important. Um, and we know pearls were particularly important to Elizabeth because they denoted purity. And
Mm,
so you see her absolutely bedecked in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pearls. Now, these could be given as gifts by courtiers or by foreign ambassadors who are bringing pearls into the country. So she's wearing them as chains. She's wearing them as, kind of details on dresses, in hair, as you say, on ruffs, on, in every which way. Um, and, along with other jewels. Now, jewels at the time weren't cut in the same way as as the brilliant cuts. They're called the brilliant cuts that we see now on diamonds and jewels, where they're kind of cut to radiate light. They really valued big, colorful, uncut gems and rocks. So often they are not necessarily, you know, diamonds or rubies. They might be kind of lesser gems, but just that they're really big and shiny and colorful. And
mm,
so that's what they value. Um, and interestingly, in the inventories, they're not listing items of jewelry like a brooch or a necklace. They're listing the number of component parts. So it's 600 pearls, or it's a rock or a ruby of this, a quartz or something. And so that definitely shows us that they are component parts of um different things, so they're using those as ingredients in a brooch or a headdress or something else,
right.
and they're constantly repurposing and constantly remaking. And
Mm,
that's in the same way as they're constantly repurposing and remaking their clothing, their ensembles. So Elizabeth is constantly sending her clothes back to the Great Wardrobe, which is the office of the Great Wardrobe, to her embroiderers and her tailors there to remake and refresh. And it's why outfits are in so many different component parts as well. So there's a bodice and there's a sleeve and there's a gown and there's a petticoat, and so the whole outfit, jewels and all, is always getting refashioned and remade. One of the things I really love, jewelry wise, is the fact that, and I may have mentioned this in the talk that I gave, is that actually in the Ditchley portrait, you can see the Black Princess ruby in that portrait, and that was, a ruby that, well, actually it's not a ruby, but I can't remember what the stone it is. It's not quite a ruby, it's one of those lesser gems, but it was owned by the Black Prince, and it's still now in the state crown. So it's one of those, only one of the only kind of links through all of those monarchs that survives, but you can see it in the Ditchley portrait and you can see it in the contemporary crown.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's
so
cool.
Yeah, very, very cool. So we talked about obviously the magnificence of the clothing, and I want to talk to you about how they might have dressed when they were relaxing and dressing down, and did they really wear all those amazing clothes all the time? But one thing I would like to ask you about before we do that is their shoes. In
Yeah.
portraits, it seems to be they've gone amazing, amazing, amazing shoes. We'll just stick some sort of feet-shaped material around the bottom of our feet, and they just do not look attractive. Is that the case, or am I
Yeah,
being cruel?
no, I think probably it's probably fair. So yeah, I think, shoes that we see in portraits, we know that they're more akin to sort of leather slippers in lots of ways. You've got these kind of wide shoes, Henrician shoes, white leather. You can, if you look at the Holbein portraits, they kind of these really kind of flat, square-toed shoes. There's a little bit of detail on them, a little bit of cutting and slashing of the leather to add a bit of pattern. In later Elizabethan times, the shoe becomes narrow with a small heel, but it's a similar kind of, in the portraits, it's white leather with a bit of cutting and slashing. In the next century, they get a bit more exciting. You start to see a few pom-poms and ribbons arriving. But they're not as decorative as, as they might be. Although in the inventories, there's a bit more of a tantalizing glimpse. For example, Catherine Parr really liked hats and shoes, and she liked foreign imported hats and shoes that were quite different from the way that things appear in portraits. So we know that she liked different colors, different fabrics, sort of tufted hats and different colored shoes. So then it may be that what we're seeing in portraits isn't representative, and that it's chosen, to kind of offset the rest of the outfit. But yes, they do seem very plain. I think it's because really the idea of kind of shaping to the foot, as a technology, if that's what it is, didn't arrive for a few centuries. So they were a bit crude and rudimentary. That we've got a couple of riding boots survive, but similarly quite plain, but in brown leather and high, up to the knee, but not massively decorative. And of course, I suppose what they're wearing indoors might, is going to be different from what they're wearing outdoors, because the road, it's muddy, the roads aren't tarmacked, so maybe what they are wearing indoors are essentially slippers in some ways. So it's a good question, and yeah, one that deserves actually, probably a bit more looking into, actually.
Yeah. So
Yeah, there you
if
go.
only you knew someone who's writing a book about fashion
Yeah, there
history.
you go. Thanks for that.
It's always amused me that it sort of seems almost like an afterthought,
Yeah,
or with the ladies, the dress covers it, we won't worry about that.
yeah,
Well, of course now, well, from not that long after the Tudors and forevermore, shoes have been they're literally, you look, Catherine
yeah,
Middleton goes out, what shoes has she got on?
yeah, exactly. And so, and there's a whole thing, isn't it? Start your outfit with the shoes. Apparently, not that I've ever done that, but that's
And that's probably someone who had a lot of shoes is probably
Yeah.
the one who managed to say that, and a
Yeah.
lot of clothes then to mix and
Yeah,
match.
exactly.
But so what, I mean, I've had the very fortunate experience of being dressed in Tudor gowns by Samantha Rees when we go on when I do my tours. She comes along and dresses some of the ladies and men up, and she brings a dress for me, and I dress up, and and you feel absolutely splendid.
Yeah.
But when it's hot, or as soon as you actually have to do anything, sit down, eat, I don't know, you start to be like, right, okay, oh, well, can I get this off soon? So it kind of begs the question, did the royal court, the royals especially, I think, and I suppose their immediate courtiers, remain dressed like that all the time? Or is there evidence that they dress down, when they're in private or when it's hot? What do we know anything about that?
We do. And yes, they did dress down. So one of the adjustments they made for the temperature was, kind of woolen layers in winter and silks and linens in the summer. So there's a slight adjustment of materials. But we know it was cold in the Tudor century. They had a little mini ice age. So actually they were dressing quite warmly. So remind me of the question again. I've gone off on a tangent there.
Well, yeah, just if they dress down,
They
are
dressed
they
down, that
actually?
was it.
Mm.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we know they did because we have some Holbein sketches that show them in kind of dressed down wear. So, I suppose the equivalent of leisure wear. So you're right to say that, being buttoned, kind of being buttoned up in that way, or pinned up, I should say, because they were using dress
Headdresses,
pins. Yeah.
hats, all of that.
Yeah, all of that. It's, it's a lot, and it is restrictive. So in the privacy of their own chambers, and privacy is a relative term because they'd still have people around them, but they'd be close confidants and, people who were, especially trusted. They would be dressing down. They'd be wearing the equivalent of, well, and they call them nightgowns, but they're not nightgown, they're not kind of flannel robes that we, as we imagine. They're still very beautiful gowns. In the inventories, we know that they were sort of lined with fur and they had silk and embroidery on them. But they're these long, warm gowns that basically you could kind of wear. And they would wear embroidered coifs and caps. Along with that, there's a Holbein sketch supposedly of Anne Boleyn in this dressed down state. So she's wearing, this kind of silk gown, this with fur, and a simple linen coif, which is her headdress underneath the hood. So if you take the hood off, you've got the linen coif. And that's how she would have been with her intimates, her close in very kind of intimate, private moments. Yeah, so they did dress down. They did dress down. It's probably a lot more comfy.
Good. I feel better about hanging out in my jogging bottoms and slippers
Yeah,
around the house
exactly.
now.
There is a Tudor equivalent. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to move on to questions from my patrons shortly. They've got very interesting questions, including ones about poisoned dresses,
Fab.
fashion designers, trends. They've put forward some brilliant questions. But before we end the main part of the interview and move on to that, can you would you like to just tell people where they can find you and and your work if they want to look you up a bit more on what you've been doing?
Sure. So my books, I've got Tudor Fashion and Tudor Textiles, are available online from Yale University Press or from Amazon. But so if anybody wants to have a look there, there's obviously a lot of detail in there. But in terms of talks or things, lectures or things that I'm doing, I don't have very many. I'm not particularly as good as I should be on advertising all of that, but I do have I do post on Instagram, so it's Eleri_Lynn, and I post talks or tours or things that I'm doing up there. yeah, I should probably get a bit better than that, but there we go.
Well, as long as you post it on
I
there
post
and
it
people
somewhere.
follow you and post it somewhere and people
Yeah.
can find you. And of course, Eleri, you'll be back to speak at the Victorians Online History Festival this
Yeah,
autumn
looking
for me
forward
as
to
well.
it.
It'll be
Yeah.
amazing. So
Talking
thank you
about underwear, which is
so
my
much.
other area of expertise.
Indeed. Going to get into right under the clothing and
Exactly.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. We know that one of his jobs was to go to Thomas Cromwell's house the day before he was executed. So, you know, his stuff is already being
getting a head start.
Yeah. So, you know, there's no reprieve for poor Thomas. He doesn't know it at the time. But, you know, Nicholas Bristow went to his house and itemized and took out all of his clothes and took it on a cart to Hampton Court Palace and gave it out to courtiers as you know, kind of redistributed it. The only thing that Henry expressly asked for Thomas Cromwell's robes of the garter.